I had a viewer reach out who was in the Chicago area who had actually purchased a pair of the Borreson X3 loudspeakers and the the Access Forte 2, I believe, streaming amplifier while he was at Xpona. He actually bought the real speakers and the streaming amplifier that was at Xpona, and he took them home with him. He emailed me and said, would I be interested in testing them out? And I said, absolutely. So he then loaded them up into his car and drove them from Chicago down to my house in Alabama. So I have to give him a huge shout out. Everybody, please leave a comment for him saying thank you, because without him, this review would not be possible. Before I get too far into this review, I'm going to go ahead and get a couple things out of the way up front. These cost $11,000 per pair. They come in a gloss white or a gloss black. They stand at about 51 inches tall or 129 centimeters. They weigh about 55 kilograms or 121 pounds each. The frequency response is spec'd at 35 hertz to 50 kilohertz. Sensitivity spec'd at 88 decibels at 1 watt. Impedance is spec'd at 4 ohm. Recommended amplifier power is 50 watts. They use a planar ribbon tweeter, a 4.5-inch bass/mid-range driver, and for their bass drivers, there are two 4.5-inch drivers. Off the bat, I gotta say, these speakers look really good. I really like the way they look. When I got them in my room, I set them up initially about 3 feet or 1 meter from the back of the speaker to the wall behind the speaker. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, here's a quick example. I also set them up facing just on the outside of my shoulder per the manufacturer's spec, which you can see here. Notice how they had the speakers aimed at the same side shoulder. So that's how I set them up in terms of toe in versus toe out. And when I was listening, I liked what I was hearing for the most part, but there were certain things about the sound that I didn't really like. I felt like the lower bass was just not ample enough. I mean, it's a large tower speaker. They only use 4-inch mid-bass drivers, but I thought there should be a little bit more here. So I pushed them a little bit closer to the wall. The manufacturer's spec says that the starting position should be 50 centimeters, which is roughly 20 inches from the back of the speaker to the wall behind the speaker. So I did that. I started there, and then I kept bringing them out, and I moved them again out to about 3 feet off the wall, but I thought 3 feet's too far. A meter's too far. So I wound up settling on about 24 inches or about 60 centimeters off the wall, and that's where I left them. I also liked how they sounded on the top end facing my shoulder. So toed out just a little bit at my shoulders. So I left them there, and then I continued to do my listening evaluation. Now, during my listening evaluation, I used 2 different amplifiers. I used the March Audio P501 mono block, so I had a pair of those. And then I also used the Access Streaming Forte 2. Despite the amplifier setup, I pretty much had the same conclusion. And I'm going to tell you what I thought subjectively now, and we'll get into the objective in a little bit. Subjectively, what I felt was that there was really nice attack and really nice kick out of the bass. But audibly, it didn't sound like the bass got lower than about 50 hertz in room. That's interesting, but there's a nice, solid, punchy sound that I really liked in that 70 to 90 hertz region, typically centered around 80 hertz. I like that. The other thing that I noticed was that the high end sounded what I would say is detailed. It just sounded very good, natural, very wide sense of space from the soundstage. The imaging was really superb, just layers in the soundstage, precision of the instruments in the soundstage. And it turns out that both speakers measure practically identically. So that pair matching really goes a long way to giving you that sense of precision within the soundstage. If one speaker is different than another in terms of frequency response, then you're going to get smearing in the soundstage. Now, on the downside of things, I noticed that the mid-range had a hole in it. This wasn't just my imagination. What I wound up doing after all of my listening is I went to YouTube and I went to my Facebook group and I said, hey, to anybody who has heard the Borreson X3 speaker, please tell me what your listening impression was. For the most part, it shook up as 3 different ways. I love the speakers and I don't know why. I did not like the speakers. They had a showroom type sound, maybe boosted highs, boosted lows, but nothing in the middle. Or I liked them for the most part, but the mid-range had a hole in it. The mid-range had a hole in it. That's the one that I keyed in on because that's what I noticed. So then what I did was I brought in a pair of known neutral speakers. One of those was the Audiophiles Designs Fidelia. It's a small kit bookshelf speaker, retails for about $900 or so for the kit, for the pair for the kit, and I'll be reviewing those soon. I've already measured those. I've already listened to those. Those are a known good reference. They just don't have a lot of bass or a lot of output because it's a smaller bookshelf. But for the purpose of trying to compare tonal balance, they do a really good job. The Wharfdale Super Linton is another speaker I had on hand, so I went ahead and compared those side by side. Now, when I say side by side, I do mean that. The BØRRESEN on one side, the other speaker next to it, separated by about 2 feet, both of them pointing at my shoulder, music mixed down to mono, same output level to within about half a decibel using my RTA. So that way I could say, yeah, everything was pretty well level matched. This is a good comparison. And now I'm just going to focus on the tonality, the tonal balance of each speaker. When I did that, it became immediately clear that there is a hole in the response in the mid-range area of the BØRRESEN X3. It was very obvious. Now, I wouldn't say it's to the point where it aggravates you. Typically, if it were going to be an aggravating sound, it would be something that would have a boost. And normally it would have a boost for me in the higher frequency above like 2K. If it has a boost in the mid-range, it's going to sound a little bit too bloomy. And I can deal with hollowness in the mid-range if I'm not looking for accuracy. But if I'm looking for accuracy, I expect that area to be filled in a little bit more than the BØRRESEN X3s do. The other thing I noticed about these that I would consider a con is that the mid-range to tweeter area, that 2 to 4 kilohertz area, sounded a little bit soft. Now, if you've watched some other reviews, you know that that's one area that I typically key in on. I'm looking for something to be smooth through that region. I don't want to bump in that region because I don't want it to sound like it's tearing my head off when the sax goes, okay? But I also don't want a scoop in that area because it takes away the dynamicism, the clarity, even the presence in a song that I feel like should be there based on the source material. I'm shooting for a speaker that gives me what is on the recording as opposed to altering the sound in some way. I don't like to have a speaker that's colored for that reason. So with that said, I noticed that the BØRRESEN X3 was a little bit subdued in that upper mid-range, lower treble region. Now, I thought some of this could be because of the way that they're positioned. My seating position was below the tweeter level by about that much, but also the BØRRESENs are tilted back a little bit, as you see in this photo. Because of that, that tweeter level aims above your head, and I thought maybe that was why. So at that moment, I got up and I emailed the manufacturer to ask them, what should I do about this? Now, I got an email back saying that this is how they're designed to be listened to. We actually want the sound to be projected, I should say, above the listener's head. And they gave a reason for something to do with that's what you see on a stage. You're below the musicians. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've never heard that explanation. I don't buy into that. That's not for me, but that's what they told me. So that's the way that they're designed to be listened to. Having said that, what I wound up doing was I took the little pucks off the front feet, and that allowed me to tilt the speaker up a little bit more and get it more level with my ear. I also put a couch cushion underneath my butt, and I sat on that to get my ear on level with the tweeter axis. And when I did that, the softness, the lack of presence and detail that was there before was mitigated. It wasn't completely removed, but it was mitigated. So I would say that in terms of tonal balance for what I'm looking for, the hole in the mid-range and that lack of detail in the upper mid-range to lower treble region are things that I would like to see corrected in this speaker. Now, I may not be their customer, and that may be the target they're shooting for, and you may like that sound, but I'm just giving you an idea of where I am coming from. The other thing that I found about the X3 was that the soundstage projection tended to be a little bit larger and a little bit more diffuse than the other two speakers that I just mentioned. Now, that may be because the other two speakers are physically smaller, but if I had to guess, I would say that really hinges on the crossover handoff between tweeter and mid-range for those other speakers, where vertically it's a little bit more smooth as opposed to the X3 where there's kind of a kink. You can tell that there's a handoff between the tweeter to the mid-range, and that actually does show up in the data, so we'll talk about that soon. I find that interesting, and I just wanted to note that. Now, you may not be bothered by it at all. Frankly, I wasn't bothered by it, but it's something that I noticed. Some people might prefer that, but I tend to prefer a speaker that sounds more point source. But then you get into the aspect of, well, how much is too much of a point source? Do you want absolute image precision, Or are you willing to sacrifice some of that precision to get a little bit more sense of envelopment in your listening position? That's up to you. But again, it's something that I wanted to note. Now, let me go back to that low level thumping that I was talking about, that nice punchy bass sound. Looking at the data, it shows up at around 80 hertz. And we're going to come back to that. I did a demo for my patrons because I couldn't do any copyright music in a video here. So what I did was I set up one speaker and then I set up the X3 and I was recording Beat It by Michael Jackson. And I was telling my patrons, listen for the doom, 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 doom. So there's a little bit of linger in that bass sound, but with the X3s, it lingered a lot longer than it did with the other speakers that I was listening to. This shows up as ringing in a waterfall plot that I'm going to show you in a little bit, but I want to make note of it because there's that trade-off, right? So you have the nice attack of that 80 hertz, that high Q bump, but then you also have the downside of where it just lingers a little bit too long and it sounds unnatural. And for what it's worth, one of my patrons took a moment to run that track through Audacity, and he found that the two bass notes were centered around somewhere in the 70 hertz region and I think 92 hertz. So that 80 hertz droning sound that's ringing from these speakers lands smack dab in the middle and perfectly plausible for why I was hearing that. Another thing to consider is when we describe sound, most of the time it's relative. So for example, some of the people who were saying this speaker had a hole in the mid-range weren't saying that it sounded like it had boosted highs. And the other people who were saying it sounded like it had boosted highs weren't saying that it had a hole in the mid-range. Now I'm saying it sounds like it has a hole in the mid-range, but I'm not saying it has boosted highs. Well, objectively speaking, it doesn't have boosted highs, but it does have through the mid-range. So relatively speaking, one could say that it sounds like the highs are boosted compared to the mids, or it sounds like the mids are cut compared to the highs because they're offset in level. And that's just something to kind of keep in mind as you're watching my reviews as well as others' reviews. All right, so now let's take a few moments to talk about the data. Now remember, I measured both speakers and they both pretty much measure the exact same way. So there's not a concern that one is messed up and the other one's completely fine. And if that were the case, then you definitely would notice it when you're listening because you wouldn't have imaging precision. The images would just be all over the place because one's a busted speaker and the other one's not. So I want to go ahead and make sure that people understand that up front because when you see the data, you're going to probably think, is this thing broken? People actually ask that. No, it's not broken. Both measure the same way. And here we are. And for what it's worth, I did find a couple other websites that have measurements of other BØRRESEN speakers that show a similar high Q bass bump. So it makes me think that this is part of their design intention. And that's fine if it is, but I just wanted to make sure that you all understand that this isn't just my data that's showing this kind of trend. All right. All the data that you're about to see was captured using my state-of-the-art Klippel near-field scanner, which allows me to get anechoic data in a non-anechoic environment. The reason that you want anechoic data is because you want to understand what the speaker's doing before you put it into the room. If you put the speaker into the room and then you try to figure out what's going on, good luck. But if you have actual anechoic data measurements before you put it into the room, then you can go back to that and you can say, oh, there's probably an issue here, especially if you're talking in the bass region where there's so many modal issues from the room itself, where you can't really see what the speaker's doing before the room has its influence and just muddies everything up. Starting off with the impedance, minimum impedance is about 6.1 ohm above 80 hertz. Minimum EPDR is about 3.7. So for the most part, you don't really need a really strong amplifier to drive these, at least in terms of impedance load. Notice also that I'm calling out a few resonances. There's this one around 300 hertz, it's a strong resonance, and there's this one around 2 kilohertz. Here's the impedance from both speakers to show you that, yep, they pretty much measure the same way. Now, here is the on-axis frequency response. Average sensitivity is about 86 decibels at 2.83 volts, 1 meter. F3 is at about 50 hertz compared to the mean SPL, which I take between 300 hertz and 3 kilohertz. And then F10 is at about 25 hertz. Average sensitivity, again, 86 decibels. We're about 94 decibels. So that's 8 decibels bass boost at 80 hertz right through here. This is what I was saying gives you that nice thump that I enjoyed, but it also rings way too long. Maybe you like that and you want that little bit of a thump, but it comes at the expense of too much ringing. All right, now we've got a major resonance issue right around 2 to 300 hertz. This is the same thing that you saw on the impedance plot previously. It creates a suck out of about 11 decibels or so compared to the mean SPL. Do you hear that? Yes, you hear that. Do you hear it as severely as this shows? Well, yes and no. Our ears don't hear at the same resolution that this graphic shows, but this graphic gives us a very good indication of how we're going to hear the speaker. So basically what I heard was a scoop that probably went right through here at about 8 decibels, 7 decibels down or so. And then it comes right back up. Now this right here, mid-range, is also scooped a little bit, especially when you compare it to the tweeter level. So the tweeter level is over here at around 87, 88 decibels. The mid-range with the scoop is at around 85, 86, somewhere around this area. And then with this, if you kind of smooth this off and drug a line through it, that would be another, what is that, about 80, 79 decibels. So between this dip and this dip in the mid-range, you're anywhere from about 8 to 10 decibels below the tweeter in the mid-range. Now that is what people were saying they heard. They heard a hole in the mid-range, or they heard brightness in the tweeter because there's a hole in the mid-range. But the data clearly shows what's going on. Another thing that I want to point out is I talked about earlier that the mid-range, upper mid-range sounded a little bit too soft in terms of detail. Well, this scoop right here explains it pretty clearly. Here's the CEA 2034 data set. There's some pretty significant directivity errors going on in this speaker. Here's the estimated in-room response, which gives you a general idea of the tonality you can expect to hear when you put the speaker into a room. And what I like to do is to draw a line that kind of indicates to you how I heard these speakers in the room, and then show the variations to what I heard and how they might stand out to you. So we're going to start with this bump down here at 80 hertz, provides thump, but lingers. And I say see CSD graph, and we're going to see that in a minute. On the lower end, I would say you get to about, what is this? 50 hertz or so. And then it's just less and less and less output. And that kind of jives with what I heard in my listening room, where I said just below 50 hertz, it's just not much. The thing is that this peak right here at 80 hertz takes over so much, and it really overshadows the lower bass. Going up to here, I've got this whole hollow mid-range, so it's right through here, like I just talked about. And then I said soft upper mid-range lacks detail and presence because of this right here. Those are the three main things in terms of tonality that I noticed about the speaker. And for quick reference, this is the Wharfdale Super Linton, which retails right now for about $2,500 for the pair with stands. And you can see how much more linear the speaker is. So it's going to sound more natural, more neutral, and more accurate as a speaker compared to what you get with this. Okay. Waterfall. People always ask, why don't you provide waterfall? Most of the time, it's just really not necessary. But there are some cases where you have pretty significant ringing in an enclosure or a drive unit that warrants showing the waterfall plot. So that's what I'm doing here. I drew a couple lines through here. First one, 80 hertz. See this wave right here? He's just hanging around forever. He should have died out back here along with some of the other higher frequencies. Then you've got this one around 350 hertz or so, give or take, that's lingering for a while. Now, he's not quite to the same level that this 80 hertz one is, but he lingers around for a while. And then you've got the 2 kilohertz resonance that kind of lingers around for a little bit. But this 80 hertz one is the worst I've seen to date. And that clearly jives with what I heard in my listening session as I referenced the Michael Jackson Beat It track earlier, where that bass just lingers a good deal longer than the other speakers that I was listening to side by side. Horizontal contour plot. On average, this speaker is around plus or minus 70 degrees. I like that. It's nice and wide, and it makes me happy. I like that. In terms of vertical orientation, you need to be, at least in my opinion, pretty much dead on with that tweeter axis. I know that the manufacturer emailed me back and told me you need to have the speaker aimed up above your head. And I know that some of you are going to say, well, who does Erin think he is? He's smarter than the designer. I'm not saying that, but what I'm telling you is that for what I wanted to hear out of these speakers, if I sat below the tweeter line, there was too much softness in the upper mid-range. It was missing detail and presence. If I got in line with that tweeter, it brought some of that back. And that's why I would recommend getting in line with that tweeter, or at worst, not going below or above about 15 degrees from that tweeter line. Harmonic distortion at 86 decibels and then at 96 decibels. So the mid-range for the most part looks clean. You're starting to run into some weird things going on at the higher frequency. The multi-tone distortion looks okay for the most part. It's below my personal 3% threshold. And you've got to remember, you're looking at a speaker that has, even though it's huge, it has two 4.5-inch mid-bass drivers. It's not like it has two 6s or two 8s. It has two 4.5-inch mid-bass drivers. So the fact that it's hanging around here at the 3% line, I'm completely okay with that. This peaking right here around 2 kilohertz, that's not necessarily that it's super high. It's that this graphic is relative to the fundamental. And the fundamental means that frequency response, it shows a dip at around 2K and then another peak. You're just seeing the inverse of that. And finally, the compression graphic. This is one I like to use for dynamic range. And this one's really key to go toward, again, that 80 hertz thump that I really do like, but lingers too long. So at lower volume, you want your output to match the same as your higher volume or vice versa. If your frequency response of your speaker doesn't change from low volume to high volume, then you've got a very good dynamic range speaker. You're going to hear that nice thump at lower volume, and you're going to hear it at higher volume as well. But what happens when you start turning the volume up, most speakers start to fail, usually in the bass or the crossover region. And what I mean by that is there's going to start being so much compression that it's going to actually limit the output capability of that speaker. So let's say that there's 3 decibels of compression in the bass. That means that you're losing 3 decibels of bass compared to the highs as you turn the volume up from low to high volume, okay? So with that in mind, that's what this graphic is showing. Reference to 76 decibels at 1 meter. What happens when you turn the volume up to 86, 96, and 102 decibels? At 86 decibels, things look okay until you get down around 90 hertz or so. You lose about 1.5 decibels of output. Now, when you increase the volume 20 decibels to 96 decibels, you're losing a lot more output, primarily at around 80 hertz. Then if you go to 102 decibels for a grand total of about 26 decibel dynamic range, you're losing even more than that. So right through this area, you're losing a lot of output. And I 100% noticed this when I was listening, because my listening notes said has solid thump at low volume, but doesn't sound as impactful at higher volume. This is exactly why. And this is why I really like having this graph, because it helps me feel sane, right? For lack of better words, it just makes me feel sane. When I see this, I know that at lower volumes, that speaker's bass is pretty high in output relative to the mid-range and the treble. But when I turn the volume up, that peak is diminished relative to the mid-range and treble. And that does it for this video. I think in summary, what I can say is there are aspects about the speaker that I really did enjoy. I like the high frequency. I like the radiation width. I like the room involvement. And for the most part, I really did kind of enjoy that bass thump, but that bass thump lingered too long, and the mid-range was too scooped out for my liking, and the upper mid-range lower treble was also too scooped out for my liking in terms of tonality. So that's my personal opinion, and you've seen the objective data now. So with that all said, I'm going to end it here. If you like this video, please take the time to thumb it up, and if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave them in the comment section. I can't promise I'm going to get to it. I work a day job. If you would like to help me out by supporting this channel, you can do so one of 2 ways. You can join me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner, and you can send me messages there, and I will answer you there. Another way is to just use any of my generic affiliate links that are in the discussion in the comment section below. So if you want to buy something from Amazon or Crutchfield or Best Buy, and it doesn't matter what it is, whether it be t-shirts, I don't know, deodorant, a television, or new speakers from any of those, just click that link, go buy whatever it is you want to buy. It earns me a small commission at no additional cost to you. And that adds up and allows me to do things that otherwise I wouldn't be able to do on this channel. And I really appreciate that. And I'm pretty sure that the community does as well. So with that said, I will talk to y'all later. Take care. Peace.